With me on the program now, Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer and Labor frontbencher Nick Champion. Good morning to you both. To start our conversation on the climate change deal, I just want to play you a little of what Mark Butler, the opposition spokesman on climate change matters, had to say today. He was questioned on comments yesterday that Clive Palmer might have been the victim of Jedi mind powers from the government in doing this deal.
Jedi mind tricks work on pretty much everyone except Jabba the Hutt. I think he was the only one I remember being able to resist Jedi mind tricks. So I pay no disrespect to Clive Palmer being vulnerable to Jedi mind tricks. I'm sure I would be as well. But the fact is, Star Wars analogies aside, this is a hopeless deal.
And so he's gone to the dark side?
Well, there were always questions about whether Clive Palmer was on the dark side on this question before, notwithstanding his press conference with Al Gore.
Nick Champion, you know, the Jedi and Star Wars jokes to one side and analogies to one side. This is an unequivocal win for Greg Hunt, isn't it, this deal?
Well, it might be a win for Greg Hunt, but it's a loss for the country. What we're about to see is $2.55 billion essentially shovelled into big corporate polluters' pockets to subsidise them to do what they should be doing anyway, which is reducing their carbon emissions. And what it will lead to is a very inefficient, very high-cost way of reducing the nation's carbon emissions.
How do you know that?
Everybody.
How do you know it's inefficient? We haven't seen it in operation yet.
I'm asserting it, and every economist, or just about every economist who's presented themselves to the Senate Economics Committees, and I'm sure when this new inquiry into an ETS is done, will say that the best way of, or the lowest cost way of abating carbon emissions is through an emissions trading system and not through massive corporate subsidies.
Kelly,
this is a boondoggle, it's a direct marketing scheme, and it won't work.
Kelly O'Dwyer, Nick Champion's right in saying that most economists that have responded publicly, at least, to this direct action plan have suggested it's unlikely to work. And even if there is a suggestion that an ETS should be pursued by Bernie Fraser, the government's going to reject it anyway. So what's the point?
Well, I didn't realise that Nick Champion had the powers like Cassandra to see into the future. I mean, I'm going to wait and actually see how it all works out. We've designed a very good scheme here. It's a cap scheme. It's unlike Labor's carbon tax, which was a $9 billion a year scheme. It was a direct hit on industry, on our exporters. This scheme is a cap scheme, $2.55 billion. It's not, you know, polluters that are going to receive this money, but it will be farmers, it will be Indigenous land councils, it will be anybody who can come up with a scheme to reduce emissions
and
in a most cost-effective way. Well, look, I mean, it will be a competitive process. It will be a competitive process, but the idea that this will somehow not reduce our emissions is ridiculous. I mean, clearly, anything that helps us improve our environment, anything that will go towards reducing our emissions is ultimately a good thing for our nation. And what we're hearing from the Labor Party is sour grapes. They dealt themselves out of this discussion. They refused to listen to the electorate. They refused to get rid of the carbon tax. In fact, they've said they're going to bring it back if they're elected to government in a couple of years' time. We've said absolutely not. We've already seen the effect of reducing the carbon tax, abolishing the carbon tax, which has reduced power prices by more than 5%. All of these things that we have been able to achieve in government without their support are good for our nation.
Okay, and Nick Champion, is this a situation where not just Labor but others in this debate have become too wedded to the idea of an ETS, that it's almost ideological in you know, the fervour with which this is argued, and that in some ways has stopped economists who might think direct action is a viable option from speaking up because they'll just be bagged as climate skeptics?
Oh, I don't think that's the case, Kieran. It's not ideological, it's just logical, and eventually the government will be dragged to the logical way of dealing with this, which is an emissions trading scheme. That's the way the rest of the world will move eventually. We've got one in California, one in Europe. There are carbon trading schemes in North American states. Eventually the rest of the world will move this way, and we will be left like a shag on the rock with an economy which is got a high carbon emissions, and the shock to the Australian economy when the government eventually wakes up to the logical way of dealing with this will be far greater, far harder, far harder on consumers,
Right.
far harder on electricity prices. So they've just delayed what we will always have to do.
Greg Hunt's had to manage a fair chunk of your party, Kelly O'Dwyer, a fair share of climate sceptics, hasn't he, through this process? So in that sense, he's been able to overcome that difficulty.
Well, no, everybody agrees in our party room that we need to take action on climate change. And that's exactly what we're doing. Yeah, well we have taken this policy to the last two elections. We've taken this policy to the last two elections. It's a decision of our party room. It's endorsed by our party room. We don't change our minds on policy the way that the Labor Party does and the way that the Labor leader does from day to day. We're actually pretty consistent on this.
Okay.
And we have always said that we're going to take action on climate change. We've got the same commitment that the Labor Party have to reducing emissions, 5% on 2000 levels by 2020, but we're going to do it differently. We're going to do it by incentives rather than through penalising our industry and our manufacturers
Bill
through the carbon
Shorten
tax.
has written to the Prime Minister seeking a review of the first tranche of the counter-terrorism laws as it pertains to particularly journalists who cover secret intelligence operations. Julie Bishop was asked about that this morning. I think we've got that for you. A comment from Julie Bishop this morning.
It shows a distinct lack of leadership. This legislation has been through committees. This legislation has been the subject of significant debate. The Leader of the Opposition has had numerous security briefings, and after it's passed through the Senate, he suddenly has concerns. I think you'll see that the Leader of the Opposition is actually playing politics with national security.
Okay, so you've heard that assessment, pretty blunt assessment from the Foreign Minister, Nick Champion. Your response?
Well, we've endeavoured to work with the government in the nation's interests on these matters, and all we've done here is simply write to the government and ask them to consider some of the concerns that have been brought up by the media, by the press, in regards to this matter. And all we've asked for is for the National Security Legislation Monitor to review over time the implementation of these laws. It's hardly an unreasonable request, and the government would be better off adopting the view that Tony Abbott so far has adopted, which is, to be, if you like, to seek bipartisanship, to seek common sense over these laws. No one's trying to score political points. We're just trying to make sure that those concerns, the legitimate concerns brought up by the media, are addressed in a coherent way.
Kelly, Mr Shorten's not the only one with concerns, as Nick alluded to there, about this element of the legislation.
Well, look, my assessment is not dissimilar to that of Julie Bishop. I mean, you've got one of two choices with this backflip that we've seen by Bill Shorten. The first is either he's completely incompetent, he didn't actually look at this properly, he didn't listen to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security in 2013 that actually chaired the inquiry that looked at this legislation, which was in fact chaired by a Labor Member of Parliament. So he either is incompetent, or the second choice is that he is playing politics on this issue, that he is trying to be a little too cute, a little too clever, and trying to basically make it up as he goes along and have a dog whistle to the media on this particular point. The concerns that have been raised are not legitimate concerns. They have been canvassed multiple times in security briefings. They've been canvassed multiple times with parliamentary inquiries and through the debate that's been heard in the Parliament.
Kelly and Nick, have a good day. Appreciate it. We're out of time. A quick break on AIM Agenda. Back in just a moment.